HW Media. Spy Talk, a podcast at the intersection of intelligence, foreign policy, national security, and military operations with Jeff Stein and Jeanne Meserve.
Hi there, I'm Jeff Stein.
And I'm Jeanne Meserve. Welcome to another edition of Spy Talk.
You know, Jeanne, I've long been curious about why Israel produces such superior espionage and counterterrorism dramas. So this week I posed the question to Stuart Schaffman, an American expat writer and film professor in Jerusalem. It's about intimate connections, he said.
Everybody knows somebody. Everybody knows somebody who's been involved in wars, either distant or recent. And everybody really has security on their minds. I mean, I had this conversation the other day with my son. And he said, well, it's simple. We're living in a security-obsessed country. Mm-hmm. And the thing that we really do best, because we have to do best, is intelligence.
But first, this week, Attorney General Merrick Garland took the wraps off the administration's new strategy to deal with domestic terrorism. Garland cited attacks by extremists on the right and the left, the Mother Emanuel Church shootings in Charleston, the attack on a Republican baseball game, the death in Charlottesville of a woman protesting against white supremacy, the Tree of Life synagogue shooting.
Such attacks are not only unspeakable tragedies for the victims' loved ones, they are also a tragedy for our country, an attack on our core ideals as a society. We must not only bring our federal resources to bear, we must adopt a broader societal response to tackle the problem's deeper roots.
This is the first document of its kind, and it has 4 pillars. 1, understand and share terrorism information. 2, prevent recruitment and mobilization. 3, disrupt and deter terrorism. And 4, confront the long-term contributors to domestic terrorism. I spoke about it with Gina Ligon, professor at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. She is also the director of INSIGHT, the National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education Center, a consortium of more than 50 researchers studying the counterterrorism threat. Gina, how significant is the release of this strategy?
So honestly, because it's the first strategy any presidential administration's ever had, to me, it's incredibly significant. The symbol of it, the resources it's going to release, the fact that, the Tim McVeigh bomber happened 26 years ago, and we're just now getting a strategy. To me, it's incredibly important and brave of this administration to do it.
Why are we only getting it now? Since, as you've said, this has been a threat for decades.
I think we have very clear laws about foreign terrorist organizations that are incredibly black and white, right? So if someone is tweeting support, if someone is sending money to a foreign group, that is very clear that's not America. However, when you look at enemies here in the U.S., we have all of these civil rights and civil liberties that make it difficult. Like, is that a first protected speech, or are they actually tweeting on behalf of mobilizing violence? And so I think a lot of it is that previous administrations, from all the ones I would say from 95 to present, have a real hard time protecting civil rights and civil liberties and giving a hard look at the domestic terrorist threat.
Let's talk about what this new strategy will do. First of all, does it address extremism on both ends of the political spectrum?
Yeah, here's the thing. I think you've already seen people talking about that this is a government Biden administration, witch hunt of the right. But if you look at what it was based on that OD&I threat assessment back in March, and then the DHS and FBI one that came out in May, that really outlined 5 different types of extremist ideologies, to include those who are anti-government on both ends, eco-terrorists, environmental rights groups, other domestic terrorist groups. But it also gave a hard look at the ones that are the most lethal. right? So that's the racially and ethnically motivated, that's the anti-government militia type groups. And those have been the ones that have caused the most threat. So yeah, it does cover the most range, but it acknowledges the data that shows which ones are actually killing the most people.
Social media has been an incredible factor in radicalization and recruitment. How does this strategy address that problem?
Yeah, so here's where I was a little disappointed with it, to be candid. It didn't lean enough into legislation about what we're going to do with the extremist mobilizing content. It sort of hedged if you looked at that pillar 4 and the pillar 3 about, even if we don't get the right legislation, we're still going to do this, which is important, but it's like, why not just push for it? Why aren't we just coming out with very clear legislation the way we do about foreign terrorist organizations, right?
So what would you have wanted this legislation, which it's not going to create, what would you have liked it to do?
I think to criminalize anything that has a clear tie to mobilizing violence, right? For political reasons. And so, we are Americans. We can hold extremist ideas, but we can't engage or inspire violence on behalf of those. And so I think, one of the things that is promising is they are revamping the mobilization indicators to include domestic terrorist mobilization indicators. That's a really important step. We have to watch for that. But to have very clear for both local, state, federal law enforcement to understand this kind of language is protected, this kind is not, and to have really clear criminal investigation guidelines about what they can pursue is going to be something I'm watching for.
Does the strategy address cooperation between the social media platforms and law enforcement?
Yeah, so the prevention pillar very much acknowledges the collaboration. So the new office in DHS, CP3, the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, is very much focused on, we're going to give funds to local partners to include the tech companies and tech sector to be able to come up with more locally tailored strategies to remove this content and to actually address the disinformation piece that was in pillar 4, if you saw, which is also a huge part of the polarization that we're experiencing from social media.
So what about money? What about personnel? Is that increased in the strategy?
Yeah, so it wasn't, to me, super clear about who was getting how much. So I'll be watching to see the implementation plan of that. But if you saw, there was about 77 million increase in the Attorney General's budgets, FBI, analysts. That's important, right? But it really shows that they're putting money toward the criminal investigation piece and prosecution of these cases, so we don't have a backlog. The other piece that I saw was 100 million going to the 3 kind of lead agencies that are heading this: NCTC, DOJ, and DHS. And so where's that going to go? What components are going to catch that money? Because that's going to signal what this strategy prioritizes. Is it prevention or is it disruption?
We've heard a lot about coordination and information sharing for years, and we actually saw it fail on January 6th. So is that grappled with in the strategy?
Yeah, that's I think that's the first pillar, right? Was increased information. So acknowledgement that locals are going to lead investigations, right? But also increased information sharing structures across the DOJ, so the JTTFs. I'll be interested, honestly, to understand are they going to have their own separate analyst in the intelligence analyst apparatus? Because right now, if you know how they're structured, intelligence analysts in FBI are region specific. So a regional intelligence analyst has to know any and all threats in his or her region. And so it's like, how is that person ever going to develop appropriate domain expertise to understand what a domestic terrorist mobilization indicator is compared to a Salafi jihadist mobilization indicator?
So one of the things that some people had expected is that we might see a federal domestic terrorism law proposed. Not there.
Nope. And no real mention of what the plan is to push for it.
And your thoughts?
You know, I think there's a lot of laws on the books right now that can be trained and amplified for locals to help to understand what they can and can't prosecute. So for me, one of the key ones, and Mary McCord has written a great deal about this, is the law that we have on the books in all states about unlawful militia. And so each state has a law that if you are not condoned by a civilian authority, so by your governor, then actually training or performing duties on the guise of being part of a militia or an extra law enforcement apparatus is actually illegal. So I think what this administration has done is they kind of have said, you know what, we're not going to push for domestic terrorism law. What I'd hope to see was what we're going to do is we're going to amplify and train on the existing law that is sufficient to be able to address this most significant threat.
But you didn't see that either?
Didn't see that either. So I'm hoping that they'll drop some breadcrumbs, right? In the next, from a training perspective for local law enforcement, that we do have good existing laws on the books for militia. What we don't have is really good existing laws on the books for more diffuse networks or lone actors, which I think the strategy really outlined are some of the most pernicious threats. So I don't know how we're going to address that without that law.
What some people would like to see is a focus on prevention to keep this from becoming a problem. It's a thorny issue, I think we both acknowledge. Does this strategy get to it to any significant degree?
I'd like to see some effort and money poured into prevention for schools and education. I mean, the same way we've done for education about suicide prevention or school shootings or even child trafficking. Why can't we have some of those same programmatic efforts for recruitment into online extremist groups, or at least recognizing when disinformation is being presented to you online? That should be part of any of our curriculum.
Wouldn't that be politically unpalatable to many Americans?
It would. And the problem is, you can't focus on one ideology, right? And if you look at a lot of the polarization tactics that were used, they were fomenting discord on both sides. And so that's part of it, is just recognizing any and all types of false information that are trying to foment more polarization in America.
Obviously, there are some foreign actors who are engaged in that. And I've done a couple of interviews over the last month or so where people have raised the possibility of not just domestic groups interacting with foreign groups, but there may be a funding flow between foreign entities and domestic ones. Let me ask you again, does this strategy grapple with that?
Yeah, so, I was really... that was one of the pieces, I'll be honest, I was more surprised about, was that acknowledgement of the foreign ties. We actually have a project in the Insight Consortium, King's College of London, where they're looking at those ties between international groups and domestic groups here. What we're finding is the flow's going both ways, which I think is really interesting. So we're not only importing resources in the United States from these groups, but we're also exporting them. And especially with this racially and ethnically motivated white supremacist, white nationalist ideology is actually, we're an exporter of that at this point. So I was interested to see that was part of the strategy, was to put more resources in Department of Treasury about those assets. Now, right now, unless they're deemed a foreign terrorist organization, it's very difficult to have some legislation to actually do anything about it. But I think the fact that they're at least gathering data is important.
Are there some other gaps in the plan?
So my bias, I'm really happy, and probably this is one of the most important policy pieces I've seen from any administration talk about law enforcement and military. But what I felt like it stopped short on was that it really focused on vetting and screening. So yes, it's important. We're going to add a question to the security clearance, right? But what that does is it really fails to capture the life cycle of someone in a public safety position. And really, if you look at a lot of the cases, a lot of them have radicalized while they're in or immediately following release. And so to not acknowledge that being a radical is not necessarily an individual characteristic, I think is kind of short-sighted. So I'm hopeful that there will be more resources put into the whole life cycle of anyone in a public safety position. So this focuses on military and police, but what about the Department of Homeland Security, right? The largest law enforcement organization in the country. What are we doing to be able to make sure CBP isn't, agents who are working there aren't vulnerable to recruitment while they're in position? Like we can't have any extremists in any position where the public trust is required to get your job done.
In the end, what impact do you think this strategy is going to have?
That's a great question. I'm hopeful that this strategy sends a signal that having a domestic terrorism policy is a requirement of an American presidential administration. I think every year, every administration should revisit it and see what's changed based on intelligence reports. But it should be an underpinning of how we think of ourselves in our national security apparatus. So I'm hopeful that this is going to become a norm and not just a one-time administrative coup.
Do you think it presents the risk that the U.S. will take its eye off the ball when it comes to international terrorism?
That's where you have to look at the resources, right? So when you look at the implementation plan that's going to come along with this strategy, when they talk about that 100 million being plussed up to DOJ, DHS, are they going to add capacity to both of those? Because, my opinion, and I think, Seamus Hughes just wrote a really eloquent piece in Lawfare that stated that you cannot take your eye off of the Salafi jihadist threat we are still charging people with ISIS-inspired attacks that are getting thwarted in the United States. And so to look at those resources and make sure they're not taking away from the international threat, but instead plussing up the domestic threat is going to be incredibly important.
Are there some specific markers or milestones you're going to be looking to the administration to hit over the next 6 months, year, 2 years?
Yeah, so I think the first three pillars are measurable, right? we can have some milestones. That fourth pillar, I'll be candid, is
for
very
those who
lofty.
don't know who aren't familiar with the pillars. Tell us.
Yeah, so the fourth pillar is really looking at the root causes of extremism in the U.S., right? So it's looking at historical racism, bigotry, disinformation. And yes, those are incredibly important issues, but how are we going to measure if any policy actually made a change in those? And I just don't know how that's going to be implemented. But for the first three, so increasing information sharing, increasing the information. One very important thing that I'm watching as a terrorism researcher is resources around actually getting a census of what the domestic terrorism attacks are and who's under investigation. If you look at that threat assessment that came out in May from DHS and DOJ, they still don't have good numbers, 26 years after McVeigh, of how many domestic terrorism cases they have. And so to me, how do you resource against not having that data? So I think the most important metric we as American public can kind of demand or expect from this policy is to have some better data that's publicly available, that we can see how many extremist cases are under investigation in the U.S., how many individuals have been discharged from public safety positions based on extremist beliefs, and to have those two pieces transparent and open to the public is going to be a huge milestone for us.
That was Gina Ligon, director of the National Counterterrorism Innovation Technology and Education Center at the University of Nebraska in Omaha. Coming up, Jeff asks why the Israelis produce such great spy thrillers.
Who can forget Claire Danes' portrayal of Carrie Matheson in Homeland? the hugely successful counterterrorism drama that ran for 9 seasons on Showtime.
It was right in front of my eyes. No, wait! No. And I never saw it coming. Get everyone out of here! Everyone, get out of here!
Unto this dawn.
Our country is under attack.
Unto this dawn.
And I swore an oath.
Homeland was riveting, if over the top near the end. But how many people know that the show was an adaptation of an Israeli TV series called Prisoners of War? In fact, Israeli filmmakers have developed some of the most compelling espionage and counterterrorism dramas in recent years, from Fauda, which explored the violent struggle between Israeli security forces and Palestinian militants, to Tehran, about Israeli espionage operations inside Iran. What sets such shows apart is the empathy they show for all concerned, the wear and tear and personal sacrifices of the spies and counter spies on all sides. I wanted to explore how Israeli filmmakers attained such unmatched nuance and authenticity, so I called up Stuart Schaffman, a distinguished American expat writer and teacher of film in Jerusalem. Stuart Schaffman, welcome to Spy Talk. A couple of my old-time journalist friends were over last night, and one of them, unbidden by me, brought up the latest Israeli spy drama that he had been watching called Mossad 101, now streaming on Netflix, whereupon ensued a discussion among the three of us about the high quality of Israeli spy and counterterrorism dramas. And I then mentioned the discussion that you and I had the day before about why these dramas might have such veracity, authenticity, and ring so much more true than a lot of the Hollywood productions. So tell us about that, your theory of why the Israeli spy and counterterrorism dramas are so good.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I should hasten to add that I've not seen Mossad 101 yet, but that's, in point of fact, there are any number of them that I have not seen or that I started watching and that I dropped. And one of the reasons was actually because of their verisimilitude. In other words, I live in an environment where this is the nightly news. So what I'm looking for is something a little more of an escape from the traumas that I experience, at least secondhand in my daily life. So I'm a big fan of, for example, a Scandinavian noir television series. Nothing could be farther away from the steaming Middle East. But the reason
let me ask you, Stuart, do a number of your friends share that view that we see enough of this in real life, we don't want to watch this?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Last night, I just had a conversation about a show that actually only began running about, I don't know, a year ago or so. It was filmed before the plague, and then they showed it during the year of Corona, which is a show that supposedly was going to turn up streaming in America on some platform rather called Valley of Tears, which is a really excellent show about the 1973 war, the Yom Kippur War. That one I did watch with great interest. And I had an ulterior motive for watching it because I was very interested at the time in a film that Susan Sontag made, a documentary about the Yom Kippur War that she shot while the war was still in progress. But in any case, Valley of Tears was very, very good, I thought. When I brought it up last night with a friend of mine who was over for dinner, who was a journalist, and I said, "What did you think of that?" He said, "I didn't watch it. I couldn't watch it." He said, "I was here during the 73 war. It was too close to home. It was too real." And I decided not to watch it. Now,
and that brings us back to the subject of why these films have such verisimilitude, that so many Israelis have served in the military and
That is correct.
special forces units.
That is correct. In other words, we are living, we're living so close to the front. I mean, we are the front, and everyone in their family, with the exception of certain sectors of the population, such as the ultra-Orthodox or Palestinian Israelis of, or also known as Arab Israelis, who serve much less in the military. Everybody knows somebody. Everybody knows somebody who's been involved in wars, either distant or recent, and everybody really has security on their minds. I mean, I had this conversation the other day with my son, and he said, "Well, it's simple. We're living in a security-obsessed country, and the thing that we really do best, because we have to do best, is intelligence."
And he served in an intelligence unit.
He did indeed.
He served in an intelligence unit himself. Yeah. And he's
served
interested
in
in film
naval
too.
intelligence, and then he ended up becoming a filmmaker. And he hasn't yet made any films about the military or intelligence, but I think that day will come. In fact, what inspired him to become a filmmaker in the first place is something that maybe some of the folks out there have seen back in the day. It was a film called Walk on Water. Came out in 2004. It was at the time the most successful Israeli film. It's a feature film ever in the American box office. It was directed by a guy named Eitan Fox. And Eitan Fox had been in the military, and it's about a Mossad hitman. And a Mossad hitman who's having kind of an emotional breakdown. So his superiors put him, as it were, out to pasture and hunting down a Nazi war criminal, which is what he didn't sign up to do. And he's very disappointed about this. But in any case, the film is very interesting and very successful. And I had a hand in it because Eitan Fox was my student. And he asked me to run in a class on screenwriting and screenplay analysis that I taught at Tel Aviv University 30 years ago. And he asked me to run a draft of the script through my own computer. He was interested because the film deals with is very much a film about the relationship between a Mossad guy and a young gay German who happens to be the grandson of a Nazi war criminal. And because Eitan is gay and I'm not, he wanted to run this through the brain of a straight guy just to strike the right balance between the gay sensibility and a more straight sensibility in terms of what is disclosed to the audience and at what point. In any case, I took my son to the premiere. He was about 14 years old at the time. At the end of the evening, Eitan said, "I'd like to call to the stage all those without whom, et cetera, et cetera." And I was one of them. And I go up to the stage. I came away from there thinking, there really is nothing like looking good in front of your kid. And then as we were walking home from the Jerusalem Cinematheque, which is our great film venue, and he turns to me, my son, 14, and he says, "Abba, I want to do that. I want to make movies like that. This is what I want to do." And shortly thereafter, he talked his way into the Arts High School in Jerusalem and never looked back. Went to NYU Film School, and now he's actively involved in making videos in Israel. The fact is that everybody here is so close to that. And we have a lot of other shows that reflect that. We have Fauda, in which one of the creators of the show was someone who had actually been in such a unit. I mean, that's
A
an excellent
counterterrorism
show.
unit. Yeah.
That's an excellent show.
I was thinking while you're talking, one of the things that makes Fauda so compelling is the doubt, the second thoughts that so many of the Israeli security operatives have about the work they're doing. You know, they're not cast as these sort of heroes putting down this very evil enemy. There's several levels of humanity given to the Israeli counterterrorism office, as well as the Palestinians against whom they're fighting. And that makes a very complex drama, makes it so real. We tend to have black and white villains in our
I think
dramas.
I think you're quite right about that. And in fact, one could go back to the Spielberg movie Munich, in which you have the Israeli hit team that is assigned to go and avenge the killings in the 1972 Munich Olympics. Only they kill sometimes the wrong people, and it was based on that, and it was full of second thoughts. You know, I mean, there was one point in the film where somebody is giving a whole song and dance based on a rabbinic tradition of how you must not gloat at the downfall of your enemies. And they're arguing all these fine points of Jewish tradition, Jewish ethics, Jewish values. And Daniel Craig, who plays one of the hitmen, is getting bored with all of this. And then says, you know what? I'm tired of all these discussions. What this basically all comes down to is one thing for me, and that is don't fuck with the Jews. And it was just one of these eye-opening lines. In other words, there is at bottom, there is that sentiment. And you get that sentiment in a lot of these shows, and the ones that transcend that, and Munich was the feature film that transcended that, is, yeah, fine, we get it. But what's the price?
So that was one of the rare exceptions, an American film that captured all the nuances of the assassination game, you might say. And as we know from all the what's been revealed about Israeli operations in Iran, Israeli intelligence leaders do not shrink from the fact that they are carrying out these murderous activities against their enemies in Iran.
I think that's quite true.
Yeah.
You know, we had a show here that was dropped first on Israeli television in 2010. It was called Chatufim, which means the abducted ones. It was about prisoners of war in Lebanon. And 17 years later, they get out, and how they are reintegrated into Israeli society and so on. And it was popular at the time, or so it seemed, but it only ran for 2 seasons. And I watched a couple of episodes, and I just had the feeling, I don't want to see this. It's just something that feels too close. Well, Chatufim went on to be adapted into an American series. And that series was Homeland.
Right.
Which ran for many seasons.
Right.
And Gideon Raff, who is the creator of the show, and is an Israeli who lives in America, was instrumental in putting Homeland together. And it was much more successful in the American evolution of the show. And I was glued to it. I loved Homeland, and a lot of it, of course, had to do in various points in the beyond the Iranian angle. There were a lot of points in the show that had to do with Israel-Palestine. Now, the same Gideon Raff, just a few years ago, created a show that is thought of as an Israeli show, but it's really not. It was done in English, and it showed on Netflix, and it was called The Spy. And it was about Eli Cohen, who was the most celebrated spy in Israeli history, who infiltrated the uppermost echelons of Syria, leading up to the Six-Day War, and he was instrumental in helping Israel gain an advantage in that conflict. But he was also found out and executed.
Yeah, and it was beautifully played by Sacha Baron Cohen, known famously for Borat. It was a little bit of an adjustment for me to switch from my, impression of him as playing Borat to him playing a very cool Israeli spy, but it was a magnificent drama. Let me bring up another thing, Stuart. Someone suggested last night also that Israeli films are so much cheaper to produce in Israel, and where the filmmakers can really make their profit is when they sell them to Western media.
Sure, that's true. And I think
that's the reason like Israel can produce so many, you might say, esoteric counterterrorism and espionage dramas, and that Hollywood does not.
Well, another thing that you have to bear in mind is that in recent years, there has been a tremendous globalization of television content, and that you have shows that are produced in many countries where there is government backing for filmmaking, where there are other sources of financing other than the typical ones in the United States, and then these shows end up, adapted or else streamed or aired all over the world. By the way, Homeland also had a very successful version of it derived from the Israeli Chatufim in India and also in Russia. But now what you have is, if you just take Netflix, or to pick the most widespread of the streaming platforms, you will find Spanish shows that are enormously popular. And they are very much in keeping with Spanish, with Spanish culture, but they have a global appeal, like Money Heist. Then there's a telenovela that we've been following here lately, a Mexican show called Who Killed Sarah, which is totally addictive. It's a totally over the top Mexican style telenovela, and I'm much more after a long day of ruminating about what's going on in this country, and then having it be re-ruminated before my very eyes on the 8 o'clock news on Israeli television. I am more than happy to dive deeply into the travails of a dysfunctional Mexican family for however many seasons they want to put that on my screen.
The spy dramas are all too real for people in Israel and among the Palestinians as well. Thanks so much, Stuart. Yeah,
sure.
Just a pleasure talking about this with you.
And thank you for that, Jeff. That gave me a title or two that I have to look up and watch now.
Yeah, we like to leaven the show with visits to new movies and books with spy and counter-spy and counterterrorism themes. So come back and check us out for more material like that.
And there's also a lot of serious stuff, not just here on the podcast, but also on Substack. Subscribe to Spy Talk there. I'm Jeanne Meserve.
I'm Jeff Stein.
Thanks a lot for joining us.
Come back and see us next week.
For more original reporting and insights like this, subscribe to spytalk.co on Substack and follow us on Twitter at @talk_spy. If you enjoyed our podcast, subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.